Considered one of the driving forces behind the explosion of alternative rock in the 90s, the Smashing Pumpkins were one of the decade's best-selling bands. However, their success was tainted by many issues, including internal conflicts and drug abuse that derailed the band's career for a few years. The brainchild of guitarist and singer Billy Corgan in the late 80s, the Smashing Pumpkins ruled the airwaves in the early 90s with the release of groundbreaking albums such as Siamese Dream and Mellon, Collie and the Infinite Sadness. Unlike their peers, most of which hailed from or were influenced by the Seattle grunge scene, the Pumpkins adopted a unique sound by combining a diverse set of influences such as dream pop, shoegaze, heavy metal, gothic rock, and progressive rock. Throughout their existence, Corgan has remained the sole member since the band began and has continued leading the Pumpkins since their reunion in 2006. The Smashing Pumpkins have sold 30 million albums around the world and were considered one of the biggest bands of the 90s until changing times and inner turmoil affected their momentum. Nonetheless, the band remains prolific until today, and Corgan's ambitious musical vision continues to define the Pumpkins' direction. Let's dive in and explore the story of the Smashing Pumpkins. Beginnings. The roots of the Smashing Pumpkins were established when Billy Corgan met guitarist James Iha while working at a record store in Chicago, Illinois. Corgan had just returned to his hometown of Chicago after his St. Petersburg-based goth rock band, The Marked, folded. Corgan and Iha began recording demos inspired by gothic acts such as The Cure and even performed as a duo in the early days, accompanied by a drum machine. Soon the two met bassist Darcy Retzky and recruited her into the band to get a spot on a show hosted in Chicago's Metro Concert Hall. Venue owner Joe Shanahan told the band to replace their drum machine with a real one. The Pumpkins then hired Jimmy Chamberlin, a jazz-influenced drummer who Corgan met through a mutual friend. Chamberlin's entry into the band was a pivotal moment that changed their sound to a harder, more straightforward type of rock. This musical lineup made its debut at the Metro in October of 1988. In 1990, the Smashing Pumpkins released their first ever single titled I Am One. Although it was only limited to 1,500 pressings, it was a success and even charted in the UK. Riding on its momentum, the group proceeded to record their debut album Gish with producer Butch Vig, best known as the drummer for Garbage and the producer behind Nirvana's groundbreaking 1991 album Nevermind. Gish was released in May 1991 to rave reviews, with many commending the album's strong psychedelic influence and distinguishable sound compared to other alternative rock bands of the time. Although it brought the band mainstream attention, friction between the band members had already started developing behind the scenes, which would continue to plague the band in the coming years. Corgan decided to record all instruments except the drums on the album, which caused tension between him and his bandmates. Additionally, the recording process took a toll on the band, with Corgan reportedly suffering a nervous breakdown during the sessions. In the next few months, the band wrestled with personal issues while touring with the likes of Jane's Addiction, Red Hot Chili Peppers, and Guns N' Roses. Chamberlin struggled with an addiction to narcotics and alcohol. Corgan went through a deep depression, and Iha and Retzky began a romantic relationship, separated. Peak popularity in the 90s. The Smashing Pumpkins fought hard to make it past their issues and continue as a band. Grunge and alternative rock had become the next big thing at the time, thanks largely to Nirvana and the Seattle-based grunge scene. Many fans and critics lumped the Pumpkins into the same category as the grunge bands, although Corgan wasn't a fan of being counted in the same genre. The band worked with Butch Vig again for their second album, Siamese Dream. Like its predecessor, the recording sessions were strenuous for the band. Corgan once again recorded most of the instruments, which strained relationships further. At one point, Corgan's depression had gotten so severe that he contemplated taking his own life. Nonetheless, Siamese Dream was a massive success that established the Pumpkins as one of the most significant bands of the alternative rock scene. Many of its songs, such as Cherub Rock, Today, and Disarm, remain fan favorites to this day. The album sold over 6 million copies all over the world and is now considered one of the greatest rock albums ever. The Smashing Pumpkins followed up 2 years later with the release of Mellon, Collie and the Infinite Sadness. More ambitious in both its scope and musical approach, Corgan described it as the equivalent of Pink Floyd's The Wall for the current generation. It produced some of the band's most popular songs, such as the lead single Bullet with Butterfly Wings, Tonight Tonight, and 1979. The album went straight to #1 on the Billboard 200, eventually becoming one of the best-selling albums of the 90s. However, the band's internal problems continued, with one even leading to a tragedy that left them in shock. In 1996, drummer Jimmy Chamberlin and touring keyboardist Jonathan Melvoin OD'd on heroin in New York. While Chamberlin survived the incident, Melvoin unfortunately did not. Chamberlin was later detained for drug possession and fired from the band following the incident. In 1998, the Smashing Pumpkins won the Grammy for the Best Hard Rock Performance for the song The End is the Beginning is the End, which they contributed to the Batman and Robin soundtrack. That same year, they released their fourth album, Adore, marking a stylistic shift from the sound featured in their previous albums. Adore incorporated more electronic influences and featured the band adopting a darker, goth-inspired image. The changes on the album toward a more sinister tone was influenced by the exit of Chamberlain and Corgan's personal issues. Around the time of its recording, he was going through a divorce and dealing with his mother's death. While it was highly anticipated, Adore couldn't match its predecessor's success. While working on their next album, Machina, The Machines of God, bassist Darcy Retzky quit the band and was replaced by Melissa Aftermauer, formerly of Hull. The album featured the Pumpkins' return to a more straightforward sound, but like Adore, its commercial performance fell short of expectations. Breakup in 2000. Shortly after the release of Machina, The Machines of God, Corgan announced the Smashing Pumpkins would disband by the year's end. Their final album before breaking up, Machina 2, The Friends and Enemies of Modern Music, was released via the internet in September of that year. On December 2nd, the Pumpkins held a farewell show at Chicago's Metro, the same place where the original members played together on stage for the very first time. Following the breakup, Corgan and Chamberlain formed the supergroup Zwan, along with members of A Perfect Circle and Slint. They only released one album, titled Mary Star of the Sea, in 2003 before calling it quits. During this period, Corgan also hurled accusations against former bandmate James Iha for the breakup of the Smashing Pumpkins, to which Iha responded that only Corgan could have been responsible for it. Reunion in 2006. 2 years after the breakup of Zwan, Corgan released his first solo album, The Future Embrace. On the day of its release, he also announced that he was reforming the Smashing Pumpkins. While he and Chamberlain were involved in the reunion, former members Iha, Retzky, and Melissa Aftermauer were not. The band recruited guitarist Jeff Schroeder, bassist Ginger Reyes, and keyboardist Lisa Harriton to complete their touring lineup. The band then released their comeback album, Zeitgeist, in 2007, which was recorded by the duo of Corgan and Chamberlain. In 2009, Chamberlain left the band for a second time, but this time on better terms. Corgan hired Matt Byrne as his replacement and worked with him for new Pumpkins material. Corgan then announced a new project titled Tiergarten by Kaleidoscope, a concept album comprising of 44 songs that would be released one by one on the internet. Although the band followed this unique release format with the singles A Song for a Son, Astral Planes, and Widow Wake My Mind, the band eventually returned to the traditional practice of releasing albums, although they were still considered a part of Tiergarten by Kaleidoscope. As part of the project, the band released two albums, Oceania in 2012 and Monuments to an Elegy in 2014, which featured Motley Crue's Tommy Lee on drums. Following the latter's release, the project was eventually scrapped. During the making of Tiergarten by Kaleidoscope, the band hired Nicole Fiorentino as their new bassist. Beginning in 2016, original guitarist James Iha started making a few guest appearances for the Pumpkins on their live shows, while Corgan expressed interest in reuniting the original lineup. In February of 2018, it was confirmed that Iha and Chamberlain had rejoined the band. Later that year, the band released their 10th studio album, Shiny and Oh So Bright Volume 1. It was the first album to feature James Iha in nearly 20 years, and the first to have Chamberlain on board since 2007. Their 11th studio album, Sear, was released in 2020. Presently, the band is in the middle of releasing their next project, a 3-part album collectively known as Atom, a rock opera in 3 acts. Taking on a project of such magnitude, it's evident that Corgan and the band haven't lost their drive and ambition after all these years. While the Smashing Pumpkins are no longer the best sellers they used to be in the 90s, their music has influenced countless artists, and their legacy as one of the all-time finest rock bands is undisputed.